everyone. I am Melissa Forziat. I'm a keynote speaker and the host of this Halt and Catch Fire rewatch podcast. And when I speak, my topic is something I call Take the Doughnut, which for me is an expression that means carpe diem, seize the day, seize what you want in life. And what I wanted this year was to rewatch the show Halt and Catch Fire, but this time to talk about it with real life humans. And now I'm getting a chance to up-level that and talk to people who worked on the show, which has been such a blast. I'm very excited for this conversation. And before I introduce the person that you see on screen here, I just wanted to give one quick housekeeping item. If you are new to the show, the episode recaps are safe for you up until the episode you're on. Those are spoiler-free, but the interviews are spoiler filled, and this one is definitely going to be spoiler filled. So please be aware that we will be talking about seasons 3 and 4 of the show today. And if you haven't seen it yet, you've been warned. Okay. With all of that said, I'm so excited to introduce my guest for today, who is Rachel Goodlett Katz, who is an editor from the show from seasons 3 and 4 for 6 different episodes. Welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So first of all, I'm so glad to have you. And I was just blown away by how decked out your background is. You went above and beyond.
Yeah, I mean, I've worked from home on the current series that I'm on, so I thought it'd be fun to have in my edit space to have some images up.
Yeah, this feels inspiring. I like it.
Oh, good.
Well, before we get into anything technical, I'd love to know just how did you get connected with this show? How did you get the job to begin with?
So around the beginning, the prep for season 3, there had been an editor on the series named Kevin Ross, who had been on from the beginning. I think he even got the pilot. And he had gone on to do another series, so they had an opening. And at that time, I was working on The Walking Dead, which, kind of seems like maybe an odd jump to Halt and Catch Fire, but it's in the AMC family, right? So we had a break during that time, and, they were looking for people. So I went in and interviewed with the Chris's and with Melissa. And, I was really... It's funny because I had watched season 1, and it's season 2, I believe, that they just do this just like brilliant in the writing and the producing and everything, this shift to the female story, which I couldn't get over. Like, I couldn't get over how organic it felt, that it just didn't feel forced. It felt like the right decision for the show. And I just was really impressed with the series. And then getting to meet them, Melissa and the Chris's, I was just like, okay, I'm on board. Please want me, So I interviewed with them, and I got the show and did, I only had a short period of time. So at least for that season. So I only did 2 episodes for season 3, and then I went back to The Walking Dead. And then when I came on for season 4, I did more episodes because I was moving on from The Walking Dead, and was able to do the whole season, which was awesome.
Oh, that's amazing. I like both shows, to be honest. So it makes
I
a
know,
lot of
I mean,
sense
they're
to
both
me.
great. They're both great. It's just funny. You just go from zombies to, computers. I don't know. But
there is a certain, maybe it's because they were both on AMC, but I think there is a certain cinematic quality to both shows. So it's interesting, like, although they're very different subject matter stylistically, like if I think about the pilot of The Walking Dead was like a movie.
Oh, absolutely.
And there are episodes of Halt and Catch Fire that feel like that to me too.
It's also, yes, it's really a choice, right? Stylistically, it's both. I think both series, they're written like movies. There's a pacing that's similar to a movie, right? Like, you don't need to get through stuff super fast. They let stuff linger, as an editor, in terms of that kind of pacing. So it was great. In this industry, especially as editors, it's really easy to get pigeonholed in a certain genre. So I think I kind of joke about that because it was really important to me to make that move to Halt and Catch Fire, that people would say, okay, we want you to work on this, even though I'm coming off a zombie show. Do you know what I mean? That they
So why
understood.
is it, do you think that that pigeonholing happens? Is it because your network is a certain makeup, or is it because the reels that you're sending for people to see are a certain type of work? I always thought of actors as being typecast, but I didn't know it would
Yeah,
be similar for an editor.
it is. I mean, I do think that it's interesting because I think that actors and directors, um, uh, when they started to, like, for example, you're pigeonholed as a TV editor, you're pigeonholed as a movie editor, right? That somehow you can't go between the two. And I think that once actors and directors sort of set the stage of like, look, we can do both. It's like, oh, maybe all the other, creatives can do the same. But it's more about like, for us as editors, most of the time I don't have a reel anymore. I don't think I've had a reel for a long time, but they see your resume, right? And so if you have a certain thing or a lot of a certain thing on your resume, then people think you can't, that's your skill set, right? It happens for DPs, it happens for creatives across the board. But I do think it has, if you're lucky enough, I feel like I was lucky in the sense of like I had people who could see beyond that, right?
Mhm.
And understood that editing is much more than, you can cut zombies, you can cut dialogue, it's, they understood it as much more and they gave me that shot. Um, but yeah,
Mm.
people do get pigeonholed for sure.
Okay. Well, so I'm curious to know a little bit more about what a process looks like for you, partly because, well, so I'm interested to know when you're editing an episode, like what does that process look like? But also, you mentioned that it sounds like there are multiple editors who are
Yeah.
working at a time. So,
Yeah.
like, what is that relationship? How do you divide up work? Tell me a little bit about what editing one episode would look like in that context.
Well, I guess like it can be different from series to series, but typically on the series that I've been on, it depends on when you come onto the show, right? So there's a rotation. So for example, with season three, Rob Komatsu, who's awesome and has been on the series for a long time, he edited episode one. So while he's editing episode one, he's doing much. They start. So he's in. They've shot it, he's cutting it. They start to shoot episode two. So now I'm on deck. So then as they're shooting, I'm starting to cut. And then I start to work with the director. And like as I'm working with the director for my cut and her cut, Tom Wilson they start shooting episode three. So Tom Wilson was, cutting episode three. And then we do it all again, right, as like the other episodes come. So we do that kind of rotation. And for me, it's a funny thing to come into a series that's been going for a couple years. um it's really important to have editors on the show who are willing to collaborate, and are generous with sort of teaching you what the style is, not teaching, but like, saying, we kind of like to use this sort of music for temp, or they just let you in a way that maybe you wouldn't know straight away. Rob was definitely one of those people. And So it's cool. It's cool when you have a group of people, and Tom's awesome too. We could sit at lunch and talk about like, what you're working on, or show them footage and say like, hey, does this make sense to you? Does this scene work? Does it build in the right way? Because a lot of times, while they're shooting, you don't often, I mean, it depends on the director, but sometimes you don't talk to them. And so it's nice to have, you're not working in a vacuum because you have these other people that you can collaborate with. Um, and that's ideal. That's ideal. It's not always the case, show to show, but I definitely feel like on this show it was for sure.
That's great to hear, because when I look at the show as a whole, it feels
Mm.
like every episode is really in conversation with the others. It doesn't feel, even there are a couple episodes where it feels like a different thing was trying to be done in the writing, but they all still feel like they're coming from the same show. And I think that has to happen in the edit. Yes, the writing and the acting, but I think editors have a lot of control over how we see it. So the fact that you were having those conversations with each other means a lot.
Absolutely. And then, ultimately it's like you work with your director and then it's the Chris's, right? I mean, the Chris's are at the end of the day, they are the people who are gatekeeping the style and if something feels off, they're in there with you and we try to take it to a place where it feels good and it feels right, but they're really the ones who are like, let's dial this in. Um,
Hmm.
and they're always at the end, the end process of each one of those episodes. Uh,
Yeah.
in the room with us, reworking scenes and playing. So, and they're just the best. Those.
Mm. So you came on for seasons 3 and 4, and at that point in the show, we're heading towards payoff of different storylines pretty quickly.
Yeah.
So, how much do you know about where the story is headed when you're cutting a particular episode?
Well, it depends, like a lot of times they'll have like a few scripts out, right, that you get. And, for me, it's critical that I've read the one previous to the one that I'm working on, right? But as you go, sometimes you just get outlines. So you'll get an outline from the writer's room that's like, this is what we're thinking. But having said that, even if you don't know, okay, so you'll cut episode 2, right? And then you'll get later in the episode and you realize like something's not exactly gelling. You can always go back in and play with whatever that is in episode 2 that maybe that you discovered in episode 4 or something. So you do have a little bit of room, but you're not always, because sometimes they're just breaking scripts while they're shooting. There's such a quick turnaround for a lot of that stuff.
Mm.
Yeah.
This is so interesting to hear. And, it's interesting because to me, everything feels really seamless. And to know that you're just sort of flying by the seat of your pants and you're getting a bit of information at a time and grabbing what details you can from the scripts you're getting. But it does feel cohesive to me in the
Yeah.
end. So
Yeah.
I love to hear that. So let's get into some of the episodes that you worked on specifically. So if we look at 302, which was One Way or Another, okay, so you had seen the second season where it was in a different city. It was, a lot of it was in the Mutiny House. There
Yeah.
were some specific locations that we had gotten very familiar with. And then everything changes in season 3 because we moved to a whole other city.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm curious, you were coming in for the second episode. So what were there any things that were like the hallmarks of being in the Bay Area, San Francisco, that you were trying to get across in what you cut or in the style overall?
Yeah, I mean, I think that well, first of all the Bay Area like exteriors that you see, especially with the like the Joe surfing that opens episode 2, all that was shot at the very end, by the way, of shooting. So they compiled, they were like, okay, all these pieces, all these exteriors we're gonna get at the end. And there was a big shoot day where they did all of that. And then, we just sort of had placards. It was like, this is where Joe's going to be surfing. But
Oh,
I think
wow.
that like in coming into that episode, it was really about just embracing, because there's definitely a style to the show, right? Like the Chris's write a ton of music into the show, like very specific. There is, there's this use of oneers, right? These really long oneers. And so trying to, for me, it was more about, not so much about the Bay Area. It's just sort of getting the style of the show and the rhythm of the show that was very specific. And trying to, for example, I was rewatching the other day, and Kim Pierce was the director of this episode. I believe it was her first. I might be wrong, but I believe it was her first for the series. Maybe not. I don't know. So anyway, she was awesome, but she would do these like super long, complicated oneers. Like there's the oneer. where Ryan shows up at the party, and it's like it goes around, like comes around, and like he gets offered a beer by Gordon, and then like Gordon pitches his plan to like, hey, I think we can work together, blah blah blah. And I just remember like they did that a million times, and so it's finding. Thank God these actors were so good across the board, because you're watching these takes, right? And like they have to nail it. Like the camera work has to be nailed, the acting has to be nailed. So it's finding that rhythm and understanding how, like, or trying to figure out how much of these long oneers you would use, right? Like when are you going to cut? And how do you make sure that people are listening, they're hearing what needs to be said, the performances are good and solid and emotional, and you're not just cutting for cutting's sake, right? Like you choose a moment. um, uh, so I think it was more, it was less about like sort of defining the Bay Area for me as an editor, and more about understanding the kind of basic rhythm that is Halt and Catch Fire. And really, like you said, like making sure that the episodes are speaking to each other, you know. um and it's kind of a lot of work. You get dropped into it, and it's a lot of work to sort of
Yeah,
figure.
it's a whole language that you have to learn to make sure it's staying appropriate. Very different from the oneer that you were just talking about. There's a really cool scene in this episode where Gordon's doing he has a deposition.
Oh, yeah, yeah,
Joe
yeah.
comes in at the end, but a lot of it is sort of Gordon with the suits doing this deposition, and the amount of different choices
Yeah,
with camera angles. And I just like wrote some of them down for myself. We get, close-ups of the screen that's recording Gordon,
yeah,
close-ups of Gordon, close-ups of Gordon and the screen, Gordon side by side, close-ups from the end of the table, it was, shots from the end of the table. Then Joe comes in, and it's the first time we start getting movement in this scene. And I just thought, wow, you must have had a lot of choices to make in
yeah.
a scene like that. What went into that? Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, I have to say, like, I love that scene. I love it. I love the close-ups of the screen. I thought those are so cool. So, I mean, a lot of the choices go into, so, you start with what the actor gives. Well, I should say, you have what the DP and the director are giving you, just in terms of the setup, right? And then the rhythm, I think, is really dictated by the performance. So it's kind of, it's like a dance or music, right? Like you're deciding, uh because sometimes like an actor will mess up their line, and you're like, well, I can't stay on that, because they've messed it up, so I've got to go to this. But at the same time, you're thinking, like, for the screen, I remember being very specific about when we would go to the screen based on what he was saying, because I do think it's very, it can be a little distracting, because it's not like real life, right? Real life, but it's not his face. So it's sort of taking you outside. So I felt like there was a rhythm to when you would go to that screen, because I wanted you to be able to register. It was a special moment, right? To register what he was saying on that screen. And then there was moments on his face where he just crushes you, when he realizes, like, he doesn't know if they're friends, right? If he and Joe are friends, like that, at the sort of last shot of his face that lingers. So yes, it's a ton of choices, but it's like, I have to say, it's fun. It's why I became an editor, because it's like I get to kind of, because I love performance, and I love being able to craft it in a way that it resonates as you're
Yeah,
watching it.
I
Um,
loved that scene. And so there's that episode. There's also another very powerful moment with Gordon at the end where Ryan has just quit. He's left the office, and it leaves Gordon reeling. But Gordon looks a little off balance, and there's some funny things happening with the light.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
The lighting of the scene, the lighting behind him. And he goes to start taking note of his symptoms again. And to me, this whole thing feels like really, really heavy foreshadowing in a subtle way, but
Yeah.
foreshadowing, like you notice it when
Yeah.
on a rewatch. I'm curious. I can't imagine you knew that Gordon was going to die in season 4 at this point, but there's a lot of things with light that
Yeah.
happen consistently across seasons 3 and 4.
Yeah.
So, what did you know? How much were the editors talking with each other about this, or were the creators telling you what needed to happen here?
I'm not sure that I knew he was going to die, to be honest. But we knew he was sick, right? And I know that they, with the light, it was a way of tipping the stuff that was happening with his brain, right? Like, how do you, if something in your head, like, how do you show that visually? What's that old saying, like, show don't say. It's like it. And I think so much of Halt and Catch Fire is about that, is like the visuals, and the little lighting hits, the silence, that it creates in these performances. But yeah, I mean, that lighting stuff is, I don't know if you remember when it's in the other episode I did in season 4. It was the one where he burns the books at the end. So I don't know if you remember the light that
There's
comes
like a
across.
lens flare. Yeah.
That was the technique that they started to use.
Yeah.
Um, uh, and in Goodwill, they used it also when she's singing to the baby, and it dissolves to him exiting the car and jumping off the cliff. There's that big light that happens.
Yeah.
But that show, like, I mean, the DP was the design of it was just so cool. The lighting was just so cool. But yes, you're right. Like, that was early days of using that
Yeah.
light, to try to tip that feeling, um,
Wow.
of his brain decay.
Yeah, there was a progression happening for sure.
Yeah.
So if we go to the next episode that you did, 305, which is Yerba Buena, I really like the pairing of Joe and Ryan, and I think there's always interesting stuff that happens on screen when the two of them are together. I think even apart, the two of them are very interesting characters. But there is a whole scene where they're trying to decide together what the next project is going to be.
Yeah.
And there's it feels like we're getting a lot of edits, but it feels like there's a lot of movement in the scene, except
Yeah.
there isn't. They are just standing there, but I feel like they're moving in this scene. And I'm curious, like, how do you approach something like this when you've got two characters who've got a lot of energy? They're really, doing a lot of forward motion in their ideas,
Yeah.
and yet they're sort of just standing there. How do you make this look interesting?
Well, I mean, I think it's really about, again, I think it's really starting with the rhythm that the actors give you, right? And like, those two actors have a lot of energy. And I think this one was directed by Andrew McCarthy. And I think he was really good with them. I think he was particularly good with Ryan in terms of being able to, sort of craft what his character was going through. But I think it's really about kind of, it's like, when to cut after you've been doing it for a long time, I think. I mean, maybe people know right away, but like, I think there is this sort of instinct of like, I need to be on the other person. I need to know what they're feeling, um, uh, as a reaction to what this person is saying. And it's just constantly trying to keep the energy in those particular scenes, to keep the energy up without being overly cutty, by the way, because that's not exactly Halt and Catch Fire style. There are shows that are, where it's like cut a minute or second. But I don't think that is true for Halt. But it's hard for me, like, when I talk about editing and sort of understanding when you make a decision to make a cut. I think that I've been doing it for so long now that it feels very instinctual, but it really is dictated by what you're seeing. I mean, I'll sit and watch all the dailies, you watch the performances, and I sit in a room by myself and I'll be like, wow, that's so good. It'll be like a line that I'm like, oh, I have to build to that particular line, right? Because you see it in the performance. I mean, I'll have visceral reactions in my own edit room where I'm like, that is amazing. And I have to figure out the puzzle, right? You have to figure out how you're going to weave your way to that line. Um, and it's really about just watching and seeing what they're giving you, you know?
Yeah. Well, when I saw that you did this next episode, I was like, I want to ask every question about it. I love Signal to Noise, episode 402. I don't know. It's a big thing to say it's like my favorite episode of television ever, but I don't know. It's like in a conversation for me. And what's interesting about the edit is part of the reason why I love it is just all the Cameron and Joe stuff is just, it feels like a riff on Before Sunrise, that sequence of films to me. But to adapt it to a TV show where you have to get from those scenes to scenes with other characters, and it still worked really beautifully for me. So one of the questions I have about this is knowing that like the Joe and Cameron stuff is slow. It's a long phone call. We're really sitting with this relationship. There's not explosions. There's nothing really fancy happening. There's like, a knock on the door is the most exciting thing that happens, but you have to somehow make that make sense with other stories with other characters that are moving faster. So it feels like quite a challenge to find the pacing of an episode like this. And I'm like, how do you approach something like that when you've got really different things happening like this?
Well, I have to say, the director Mira was really, I think it might have been her first on this show. She was really.
This was her first time directing?
No, it wasn't
just
first time. First time on the series.
Yeah.
But she didn't have a huge resume. I think she had a really great feature she had done. And she's gone on to do a ton of stuff, by the way. She just is so talented. So I started to get this footage of them on the phone. And yeah, it's that thing of like, again, I sort of go back to when I would decide to cut to Gordon on that screen in the deposition. It's kind of the same thing. Like if you think about it, when you watch it, it's like you have the person on the phone. And so when are you on them when they're talking? And when are you on them as they're listening? Right? It's like, it's a fine balance. It's a fine balance because you want to understand what it is that they're saying on the phone, right? And have you checked out because they're not, we're not seeing sync? I don't know. So it's like, it's finding it's funny when I watched it again, it's also about the rhythm of the things that they are doing. So for example, and this is small, but when his phone starts to die, and he goes into the other room, right? And he's like, hold on. And he picks up the phone. And there was something about the way he picked up the phone and then she adjusted herself in this wide shot. And it's like the rhythm of that, which is so cool because they're not doing any sort of big actiony thing, but it is a choreographed dance that they're doing. And also, I just have to give it up for the writing in that episode. Oh my God. Like how amazing when I was watching it again, it kills me every time when she doesn't know the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air.
Yes.
And he's like describing like, okay, so he
Philadelphia.
got in trouble on the basketball court. And it's just so amazing. And she's sitting there with her little M&Ms at one point. Like, it's just so, the writing and the way that things they're revealed to you before they're revealed to you. Also, too, in the Donna and Diane stuff. Remember when they're talking about Trip and they talk about him like drilling down, they joke about him drilling down. And we're like, I don't know what's happening, right? And then it gets revealed later.
Yeah.
It's like the whole episode has those little nuggets.
Yeah.
So it just makes, I mean, I remember feeling like I just really loved that episode and it didn't feel that hard to me, right? Like it didn't feel there. Sometimes you come across episodes of TV as an editor where you're like, oh my God, this is such a slog to get it up, to get it to like come together, to get the everything to work, because sometimes it just doesn't. But for this, I think there was just a Midas touch that came from the writing, started with the writing, and then the directing, the shooting that came to me. And it just felt like as you watched it, there were just these natural moments where you're like, I have to cut here, right? Like when she's doing her, when she reveals that she was in a beauty contest and she does her little pose, right? So like
Mhm.
she starts her pose in the mirror and then we cut out wide to the side. So she's finished her pose. And it's like moments like that where you're like, I want to see her saying it. I want to feel her in the mirror as she remembers that moment. But then we also, as a viewer, want to see what that pose is, right?
Yeah.
Um, so it's just building the puzzle in a way that feels satisfying, you know?
Oh, it was brilliant. And I want to, I don't know if I can even find a question in here as much as a thank you. There's like a 3-second choice that's made with
Oh,
something Joe is saying. And it had a bit, it was like, I remember seeing it for the first time and going, wow,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Joe is talking about his dad.
Oh, yes, yes.
They're still on the phone and he's talking about how he used to think he didn't want to have kids because of his dad. And we're seeing this whole sequence from this side and he's sort of up like this with his hands gesturing like this. But then he says, and I actually took down these words as he's describing his dad. He says, he was huge and imposing. He made me feel small, like I was less than nothing. And for just those lines, the camera angle switches to this.
Mm.
He's now doing this. Actually, it's sort of like looking down at him like
Yeah.
his dad. And obviously, Joe's relationship with his dad was not a good one. We've seen that before. We've seen it be emotionally abusive. But that was the first time that I was like, wow, was he physically abused?
Right.
And
Yeah.
I got that in 3 seconds of the choice to use a different camera angle and then switch straight back to the side. And so it's those details. It's such a meticulous episode. And I don't know, was that written in? Is that something that you worked on?
No, no, it wasn't written in. I think, it was really the way, again, it's like, I think it's just a marriage of what Lee is giving on the day, right? And they have all these on set, they have all these shots planned. And then you start to see how that's playing out. And I get all this footage, right? So they're going to shoot the entire scene from this one angle and from this one angle and from here, so I get all of these. And as I start to put it together, you start to feel, I mean, I remember finding that moment. I was like, whoa, this is pretty awesome. Because you don't want to just cut to cut, you want to use these angles, but why? Right? Like as an editor, you're like, why do I go to this? What does it say? And when I found that moment, I was like, of course, like this has everything. This is saying everything, right?
Yeah.
But they also, as the Chris's, as creators, also they give you a freedom. There's a generosity that they have in terms of that stuff. Like it, we can, when he's reading in that same episode, he's reading the story and we start off just here, right? Like you just see like the edge of his glasses and you can't even see the pages really, right? And then it starts to pull around. And it's like that stuff, like that's not like a typical show. So they give you the freedom to make those kinds of choices, right? They shoot it like that, they perform it like that. But as an editor and in the edit room, you get to go like, wow, these shots could be weird, they could be cool. And so you just get to like you're sort of free to kind of make those decisions.
Mm.
And for me as an editor, I want to make sure that it means something,
Yeah.
right? That it's not just cutting for cutting's sake.
Oh,
Yeah.
powerful choices you made there. And I mean, it's like the hits just keep on coming. Because if we look at your next episode, 405, Nowhere Man, I wanted to talk a little bit. You started to talk a little bit actually about some of the Gordon choices, but there's a closing montage
Mhm.
it's set to PJ Harvey's Rid of Me.
Yeah.
And it's going back and forth between Donna playing Cameron's game and basically falling in love with Cameron's
Yeah.
game,
Yeah.
and Gordon burning the notebooks where he recorded all his symptoms, which feels like a declaration of, I've made peace with this, whatever happens, happens. And we're getting the lens flares there. So I really liked the back and forth between these. What kind of decisions go into something like that, especially a montage that's cut to music?
Yeah, and it's interesting because like her playing that game is so I didn't even really have the game to begin with, right? Because they're creating that as they're shooting and as we're starting to cut. So for that, for her, it was like, yes, she's I mean, she's falling in love with the game. She's falling in love with Cameron, right? Like I mean, it's just so great. So it's really about, and for her side of it, um, it was really about her face, and like letting her kind of discover I mean, the game was scripted, sort of where she would end up in the game. But I didn't actually have the visuals yet. So it was really just building initially placeholders, emotional placeholders for where she was going to go. And then that stuff started to fill in. And, same with Gordon, like, they're just so good. Those actors are just so good. It's like they don't have to say a thing, and it's all over their face. It's all over their face. And again, it's just sort of it's a dance, right? Like that song was scripted, which they do a lot. Which again just like increases my love for them because their taste is so good, you know. I mean, personally, I think so, but so it just became about how are we going to rhythmically get from these moments to the end, where it's like the talking about the fire, and I think at the end of the day it was really powerful. And what was so cool too, not to jump ahead too much, but I I got to, by luck of the draw, really, I got to cut that scene where she's playing the game. But then I also, in Goodwill, got to cut the scene where she reveals that she played the game.
Let's talk about Goodwill. Yeah, let's talk
Yeah.
about that.
Yeah. I mean, and that was really, it's funny, like that was really special to be able to, because that, as an editor, sometimes you just get assigned episodes because that's where you're going to fall in line. And so, she plays this game, and it's extraordinary because she figures it out. And then in Goodwill, she tells Cameron that she played it, and Cameron was really blown away. And so that whole episode, there was a lot of silence, right? And that was just looks between the two of them, which was pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, that's another really powerful episode.
Well, and that episode has this framing device. We start in the past, we end in the past.
Yeah.
And then in the middle, we're dealing with the present day grief. So, what are some of the things that you did to get us into the
Mhm.
past for Gordon and Donna's relationship?
Well, I should say, so this was Chris Cantwell's directorial debut. And that was super cool that I got to cut that, I think that,
What a debut.
I mean,
Like, and nobody knows whether they liked it or not at the end because you're just like,
you're just like weeping and you can't see through your
I think
tears.
I loved it.
Oh my God. Yes. It's
Wow.
so heartbreaking. I think that it's just so cool to open on the past. I think that there's a lot more movement in the past in terms of like the camera work. It's moving around that house. They're much more, as I'm like, thinking about it now, it's like it's a real stark contrast, right, to the stillness that ends up happening, because there's a lot of locked off shots. The framing is really interesting, but it's also pretty still. Actors sort of walk in, the camera kind of stays still and they walk in and out, right? In the present day footage. So actually the scene in the past, that was like one of my most favorite things to cut, when he gets out of the car and he jumps off that cliff. That was all, that footage was so cool. And I remember finding like this temp score. I don't remember where it's from, but it was so beautiful. And like Paul killed it with his own score, but like just to be able to kind of tell the end of that story and just these like images of him jumping into the cliff was so amazing. But yeah, I think the past had much more movement. It was much more active. And then we get into, I mean, there's a lot of them just sitting around. I mean, it's grief, right? It's just such a great depiction of grief. But there's a lot of them just sitting in rooms talking to each other.
Mm.
Um, uh, and man, it was effective.
It really was. And then in great contrast to that, so if we go to the final episode of the
Yeah.
series, 410, 10 of Swords. So I'm gonna drop a term here. I want to make it happen.
Okay.
We're having a Donnaissance.
Are.
Okay, guys,
Yes, we are.
that's it. We're doing it
No.
now. I don't know. It's about, we'll see if it picks up. But basically, we are gonna get this montage of Donna, who's now at her company, which is now called Symphonic Ventures.
Yes.
And it's, the whole montage is set to Beck's beer can.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of movement in this. We're seeing Donna moving around the office. She seems to have like a more functional outlook on the situation, and way that she operates with the team. There's a lot of creative energy. There's a lot of movement, which we haven't actually seen in that office space before.
Yeah.
And so, like, what should we know about this montage, especially in contrast to the fact that the last episode you worked on had so much silence and stillness?
It's funny. So this episode in particular, so this was Rob and myself. So Rob actually started it, and he went to do another series, and I picked it up. So I have to credit Rob to that amazing sequence. But I do think that what it lends itself to is it just feels happy, right? Like, we come from wow, such an episode of just true grief, to this thing. It just, everything about it feels lighter, right? Like the costuming, like she's so much more casual. Her hair, like the hair and makeup, it just feels, everything about it feels brighter. I think there's joy. I think there's with that song, with the camera move through. I mean, what would she bring? What does she bring for them? Tacos?
Yeah, something like that.
But like, there's just, it's so, yeah, I just think it is such a stark contrast. Like, not that we moved on, but like we're finding joy again, and then she gets that call from Joni, which just kills me. It's just like, so, but I think it's like they're finding their way. They're finding new footing. And it's really, as an editor, it's so fun to be able to get this footage, and because you get it all out of order, right? And so I never used to do puzzles, like as a kid, or even in I just never did them, and I started doing them. And I was like, wow, this is really fun. And my husband was like, oh, really? You find putting puzzles together fun? I could never imagine that. Like, like as an editor, that's what you do. You're getting these pieces, and then that satisfaction of like, when you connect these scenes together, um, uh, you just have this sort of emotional reaction of like, wow, like these work together, you know? And her, both she and Joni, that performance of them talking to each other about her trip and finding the Buddha in the tree is just like, oh. It's just really, it's pretty great. That's pretty
Oh,
great.
it's so beautiful. And this episode, um, you know, a lot of this is focused on Donna and Cameron. Like time wise, it feels like we spend a lot of time with Donna and Cameron. And, we get Donna's big speech, Cameron falling into the pool. We get them talking about the imaginary company Phoenix that they never did, but or haven't done, but imagine what it would be like. We get them maybe coming up with a new idea. How does the edit play into, like, it feels like a celebration of them.
Yeah.
So how do you play into that in the edit?
Well, it's interesting. Like I'm trying to think. So it's really about, at the end of the day, like when I came in on this episode, the Chris's, I remember specifically, it was a long time ago, but I remember there was a scene between Boz and Cameron, right? When they're sitting on the truck. And they wanted to make sure that that scene performance wise felt grounded. Like, there's, maybe it's hard to imagine, but when you get these performances, you could go a very different way as an editor. You could take the scene and have Boz crying and Cameron bawling. Like, you could build it so that they're straight out of the gate emotional, right? And for them, I think that they, really appreciate, and I think it's evident across the seasons, is, performance being grounded in reality, right? Which, ironically, this episode had that Phoenix scene, where it's almost like a stage play, right? Where you're like down and you're looking at them do this thing. I think they're willing to take these stylistically, cool and weird chances, but they still want the performances to feel like real people. So I was thinking about, as an editor, that's really, I have to get that started, right? I have to figure out how to make the scene and the performance build in a way that you as the viewer say, I believe them. And I don't always get it right, or I don't always get it because everyone has a different view of things, right?
Yeah.
But the Chris's will come in and say, let's tweak this. And that was particular to the Boss and Cameron scene, was like, let's let that build a little more before they're emotional, you know?
Yeah.
And also, it's not a final goodbye. There was an aspect of the whole episode that's like, I'm going to say goodbye, but it's not final. It's not final, right? We keep saying, like, Cameron's like, okay, I'm heading out, and then the stuff with the computer happens. And then she's like, I'm heading out. Bye. Now I'm going to fall in the pool, So it's like this really, I don't know, it's just a pretty brilliant way to kind of say goodbye, but don't say goodbye,
Yeah. Yeah.
Even,
It's like they're never really out of each other's lives. So how could it be a final goodbye?
I know.
Yeah.
So, but as an editor, I think it's really, because the words are, written on the page. The way that the story is going to build is written on the page. But for me, I have to take everything that they do on set, everything that they're discovering through shooting, and make that flow in a way that is true to the series. It's true to the Chris's vision of it. And it's a big job, but it's so fun.
Yeah. Well, as we get towards the end of the time we had allotted, I wanted to ask you like a nice solid double barrel question here. So
Great.
I'm wondering, what would you say was like the most complex scene or episode for you to edit, and what one were you most proud of? And they might be the same thing or they might be different.
Can I have two?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think my two favorite, Signal to Noise and Goodwill. Signal to Noise was just, both of them were so fun and so challenging in different ways. I think that, like we discussed, finding that rhythm of, I mean, the whole episode is almost the whole episode is a phone call.
Yeah.
How do you make that interesting? What do you want to look at the time, and making sure that those performances are really true and powerful. This is the first time they've talked to each other, really, that we have seen. And then with Goodwill, I mean, man, like, I swear I sat in that edit room and just bawled at that, like, their performances, and then going, okay, I'm feeling this way about their performances. I want other people to feel this way. And so how do I get that across without shortchanging, letting stuff linger, right? That brilliant shot of when Boz gives uh, the chili to Joe.
I love that scene.
God. And then he just, like, and it's just on Boz, and you just see him start to eat. It's stuff like that you're like, oh my, you could cut away. You could be like, okay, got the thing done, but no, like, that shot is meant to linger. We are supposed to stay there and watch him,
I'm excited to get to that scene, that particular scene on this rewatch, and try to compare it up against where they started. I want to see if I can find a scene from early in their relationship and like see what it looks like side by side, because they've come maybe the furthest of anybody in the show. And, it was just so beautifully symbolized in a bowl of chili that, like, of all things.
I know. And it's just like, and they have this way of talking to each other that it's okay. Like, I remember Boss starts to tell a story. He calls, he said, I used to call him Soup Stain. I don't know if you remember that. He's like, I'm not ready for that. And it's so funny because in rewatching that, I remember thinking, like, wow, like, how great is it that they can be that way with each other?
Yeah.
That he can say, like, you know what, I'm not ready. And Boz says, okay, I'm just gonna give you some chili.
And Boz knows the only way to get him to eat the chili is to say, it's not about him. I want to make sure this is safe and healthy for everybody else. And that actually is something that this Joe now is motivated by. It's not about him.
Totally.
I mean, whoa.
I know.
All the change.
I mean, for sure. And then, for those 2 episodes, it was just like, it's such a joy. Like, it's just such a joy to get that, and to get that footage, to have that story to tell, and, be allowed to be creative and to make choices that you're like, you don't always get to make as an editor. You're locked into a certain way of being. And I think that, the Chris's and Melissa, I think that they had this vision for the show that really, because they were so generous with allowing you as a creative to be creative. I mean, look what came of it,
Wow.
Such a joy, such a joy.
Well, is there anything that you're working on now that you want us to know about that you can share?
I can't share, but
the answer is yes. And I cannot say anything beyond that.
I can't. But what I will say is, working on Halt and Catch Fire was one of the great joys of my life. Little side note, you get swag on every show, right? And for Halt and Catch Fire, I got a jacket that had, it was a great jacket. It had a little Halt and Catch Fire. I've worked on a lot of stuff that people know. And this is not a humble brag. This is just like, Gossip Girl, Mandalorian, all these different shit, Walking Dead. And I've gotten swag from all of them that I've worn out. The only thing that anyone has ever stopped me to say anything about is my Halt and Catch Fire jacket. Oh. And I was on the phone in a grocery store, and I'm like talking, This woman came out of her way, and she's like, I'm so sorry. I just have to interrupt you. I'm obsessed with that show. And I just thought that was so cool. I was like, girl, I feel you. I'm right there with you.
Halt and Catch Fire fans are the best fans.
They're the best.
I'm discovering. I mean, like when people are commenting on this podcast,
Yeah.
it's not like loved the show. It's like
Obsessed with the show.
novel length, like here's my takes, you know, and it's so great. It's like this
So
is
great.
this is a show that was made for that. There was a lot of thought put into it from every department, and so it's great that the people who watch it want to inspect it that carefully.
I know, I love that. I love that. But
Oh
yeah.
my goodness.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for carving out all this time and talking about some of my favorite episodes. But I mean, everything that you shared was so interesting, and you know, I just appreciate you taking this time with me.
Of course. Thank you.
Okay, everybody, you know what to do. Go out there and watch Halt and Catch Fire.
Yay.
Bye, everyone.